Chapter 12 No Retreat. Emanuel Lasker, a former world chess champion, once said, "What is immobile must suffer violence. The light-winged bird will escape easily the huge dragon, but the firmly rooted big tree must remain where it is, and may have to give up its leaves, fruit, perhaps even its life." In chess, we always have to strive to give our pieces freedom of action, mobility. Without it, they can be paralyzed and have no option to flee. They can have no retreat and thereby become the target of attack. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at many examples of pieces that have no retreat. Sometimes we'll see examples where an attack fails because at the end of the attack, the attacking piece actually has no retreat. This will all become clear as we look through the examples. Let's now start. In this first example, it's black to move. You may notice that the white knight on h4 has no safe squares to go to. All of these squares are covered by black's various pawns and pieces. Therefore, the correct move here is simply g5, and that knight will have to give itself up in some capacity. In the following example, white has just played knight d5. But if you look closely, you'll see that this knight actually doesn't have any safe squares to go to. Thereby, we see the move c6, attacking that knight, and since it has nowhere safe to go to, white will have to give that knight away. In this example, it is black to move. Once again, we are trying to find pieces that have no retreat square available to them. We see here that the bishop has no safe squares to go to, and we have the ability to attack that bishop by f5. That bishop will have to give itself up. Now, a creative player might play a move like b3, counter-attacking the knight. But keep in mind here that after we take the bishop and they take the knight, we then get to take the next knight as well. So this works for black in all cases. In this example, try and see which piece has no retreat and how you would exploit that. The correct answer is that white's queen has no safe squares to go to, and it can be attacked by knight h4. We're moving on now, and we're starting to see patterns of how we can attack pieces that have no retreat. Often these are pieces that are in our half of the board. In this example, it's the white queen that has nowhere safe to go. And we can attack that white queen with bishop g6. The best that white can do is firstly force a trade of rooks, and then attempt to free up the queen by taking the knight and hoping for the recapture of rook. But, of course, black takes the queen, and white will only have a bishop and a knight for the queen. In this example, it is again white to move. We are looking for pieces that have no retreat. Certainly the bishop can retreat to b6. The knight here has various retreating moves, as does this knight. But the queen has only the square it's on, and this other square, as well as this square. And we can take all those squares away through the move knight h4, which attacks the queen, defends this square, and opens up the queen's defense of h5, thereby leaving no other squares that are safe for the queen to go to, and thereby winning the queen. In this example, it's white to play, and after you look at this position for a while, you may notice that the dark knight over on h3 has very limited options. It can come to g1, but from there it's got nowhere else safe to go. And from its current posting other than G1, it already has nowhere else safe to go. And so we get the idea to move our king towards the knight. We play king f1, and then king g2, and this knight's going to have to give itself up. The best that can be done here, according to Stockfish, is actually knight g5, a very pretty move, saying to white, if you take my knight, I'm going to take your knight. But here white has this passed pawn, and after king f3, there's absolutely nothing that black can do. Pushing this pawn makes no sense. You're just going to give us another passed pawn. Pushing this pawn, likewise, is just going to give us the time we need to get our king up and promote the pawn. And if you try and defend with the king, we bring our king in as well, and eventually it's going to be completely hopeless for black. White's winning here. In this example, black's just taken the pawn on a2. This is a very famous kind of a pattern, and it's very good to be aware of. When you have a queen that's supporting a bishop from long range, you can interrupt their communication with a move like b3, and all of a sudden this bishop has no retreat. The best it will be able to do is give itself up for a pawn. In this example, black's just dived in and taken the pawn on a2. We're tempted to play rook a1 and attack the queen immediately, but don't forget the queen can take the knight. But from that observation, we get the answer knight c4. Knight c4 defends the b2 square, so the queen can no longer use it. It also defends the a5 square, so the queen can no longer retreat through that square. There's really nothing black can do now. After the next move, we're going to play rook a1, and that queen can only give itself up for a rook. Again, this is the power of isolating pieces that have no retreat. Sometimes, however, you need to use tactics to realize that there's no retreat. For instance, in this example, we see two knights on the board. We see lots of white pawns steaming ahead at those knights, but no obvious way to trap them. For instance, if we play f5, it would appear that we just give up the pawn on e5. But you have to be able to see that once the knight lands on e5, with another knight here on c5, we'll have d4 forking both knights. Therefore, the tactical pawn double attack justifies the idea that this knight actually has no safe retreat, and from that we get the idea of playing f5. In this example, once again, we have to identify pieces that have no retreat, and we have to create a scenario where the piece has no retreat. The way we do that here is we're very suspicious of this bishop and knight. We realize that after g5, the bishop's very much forced to go back, and then we can attack that knight. And there's not a lot of great squares for that knight. In fact, the only safe square is h2, but after it occupies h2, thereby taking the square away from the bishop, we can continue with h4, and that bishop is now lost, has to give itself up, and black is winning. In this example, we're trying to think of a way to make the most of a piece that has no retreating squares. We see that this bishop's feeling very boxed in, and that after we, for example, take this bishop, which forces a recapture, we would be able to push to f5, and that bishop's looking very, very shaky. The only square for it really would be h5, and then we would be able to also play g4, and that bishop would be a goner. So that is the move. We take the bishop, and after the recapture, we're hemming that bishop in. Here we have the option to play g4, and all of a sudden that bishop is lost. The best it can do is possibly a counterattack against our knight. Here Chernev and Reinfeld give the idea of just retreating the knight. The bishop here remains lost and will at best give itself up for a pawn. Stockfish improves upon that idea, saying rather than retreat the knight, you capture en passant, like so. And even if the bishop does recapture, you've now opened the way to add pressure to this knight through bishop g5, pinning and winning either the knight or the rook behind it. In any case, either Chernev's or Stockfish's ideas result in a far superior position for white. In this position, it is black's move. Black takes the knight, and the question is why? Well, if you take the knight, white's going to be forced to recapture, and now we can gain a tempo on the queen through c5, and when the queen moves, we can trap the bishop with c4. Let's see that one again. We notice that the bishop really has no safe squares to go to, and that gives us the idea to amplify pressure against that bishop. The most forceful way to do that is by taking the knight, forcing a recapture, attacking the queen, forcing a retreat, and then putting the final nail in the coffin of that light squared bishop. In this example, the black knight has just forked the white king and the white pawn. This is an example of an attack where ultimately this attacking piece is going to find itself with no retreat. And you can almost tell that instinctively based on the fact that this knight is all alone deep in white territory. Let's see how this plays out. It's white's turn. White moves the king, attacks the knight, and the knight jumps over and wins the pawn that it jumped in to get. What's the move now for white? How can we trap this knight? Well, of course, we have to attack the knight. And the knight suddenly has no retreat, no safe squares, it is lost. Cautionary tale about any attack that you might want to start, make sure that any pieces at the end of the attack will be safely able to evacuate. In this position, black thinks that they've seen a great and clever attacking move. They play the move knight takes f5, allowing bishop takes bishop because they see that in response there is knight d4 checking the king and forking the other bishop, which is true. But you must be careful because after the king moves and the knight takes the bishop, this knight cannot retreat back towards its own home. All these squares are covered. In fact, this is the only safe square. And after a move of a4, forcing the knight to take that square, it now has even less hopes. Its only hope is now b1. So after we attack it again with bishop e7, the knight has to take up residence on b1. And now it has absolutely no safe squares. And so king c2 wins the knight and the game. In this example, can you see the piece that can be attacked and has no retreating square? It is the knight. And what is the move that most viciously attacks the knight? h4. In this example, we are going to see something similar to what we saw before, thus embedding these patterns into our minds. We see that this bishop is in our territory. At the moment, it can still retreat all the way back to safe squares. But we could try to lock that bishop in through what move? f5. That bishop now has no retreat. After the next move, we can attack that bishop with our rook, and now the best it can do is give itself up for a pawn. In this example, how can we attack a piece that has no retreating square in order to win material? e5. Attacking the knight. The knight has no safe squares to go to, and the best it can do is give itself up. In this example, which piece can we attack that has no ability to escape. It's the black queen. How can we attack it? Knight e3 attacks the queen, which has no safe squares to go to. The best it can do is give itself up for a rook or counterattack our knight. That concludes the chapter on no retreats. In the next chapter, we're going to be adding yet another tool to our arsenal. We're going to be adding the skewer.